So, as Brian kind of alluded to, we're obviously entering kind of this new phase of AI adoption, right? And that's really characterized by agentic AI. So I know over the last year, maybe last 2 years, we've spent a lot of time worrying about what users will type into chat box, right? So as they're interacting with ChatGPT or Gemini or Anthropic or whatever. But really, what we're seeing from our customers and just surveying kind of the field and landscape is it's really the risk is shifting towards AI agents that can access things autonomously, right? So in this session, what we're going to discuss is the model context protocol, so acronymed as MCP, and that's really the emerging standard for connecting AI to data. And we'll showcase how we at Nightfall are providing the industry's first kind of visibility and control layer for this new vector. Um, just a brief primer for MCP for those that aren't familiar. Obviously to be useful, AI agents need data, right? And so MCP is really that bridge that makes this happen. It allows tools like to make it a little bit less abstracted. It allows tools in a developer's environment. For example, if they're using VS Code or Cursor or Cloud Desktop, they can use those tools to connect directly to corporate data sources, right? So it's one thing to kind of use AI as you're writing code, but then the code and the AI that you're using gets a lot more context, is a lot more powerful if you can connect it to your own code repositories. So MCP is just a standard to do that with common applications like GitHub or databases or file systems that are running locally. And so what we've seen is the problem with this is there's just a massive blind spot for security teams, right? There are already over 18,000 MCP servers. They've been different kind of places where you can find MCP servers. And obviously that number continues to grow as more vendors support the MCP protocol and new products become data repositories where people want to connect MCP to AI. So, there has always been a mandate, even with me as a CEO, like there's been a mandate from boards to say, hey, have your organization use as much AI as possible. And so people are obviously using these things to move faster and faster, and that often happens without security oversight. So, if we go to the next slide, what this is really showing you is making kind of the data leak potential of an MCP connection less abstract. So, why is MCP so dangerous? Because it really operates outside of most of the traditional security controls. Um, and likely, obviously all of you that are Nightfall customers have controls for cloud SaaS, email, web uploads, but that control for MCP is likely missing. And even if you're using other solutions, you have like a network proxy or something like that, it becomes hard to distinguish MCP traffic with normal traffic. And it's usually not even giving you coverage on local MCP usage. So we'll cover that a little bit. And so there are kind of two flavors of the ways in which you can consume things that run via MCP. One is local kind of inter-process communication. So like my application might be wanting to do something with my local file system. So that's not happening over a network. That's just happening over inter-process communication or SCDIO pipes. And so that bypasses network monitoring entirely. And then there's remote kind of talking to MCPs, and that's happening obviously through the network. And so an AI agent could read customer PII from a database, for example, and exfiltrate it via direct connection to an external service, and that won't leave an audit trail typically, and likely won't trigger alerts in any legacy DLP or proxy systems that you're using. Um, if we go to the next slide, and so we wanted to validate this with our existing customer base and also just folks that weren't customers, just to get a sense of how big is this problem and what do folks think about just the risk related to MCP. And here's some quotes from large companies that we've talked to. Um, the consistent kind of pain points that we'll hear from CISOs and also engineering teams is that there's a discovery gap. So they just frankly don't know what MCP servers exist in the environment. Um, and then there's a trust erosion, right? Because they can't tell if the MCP is a trusted MCP or has become malicious. Like maybe it's acting like a verified MCP, but it's really a malicious third party. Um, And so, or the MCP is just being used improperly to exfiltrate data. And so there's no real way to enforce the difference between kind of enterprise AI usage and personal AI usage at the protocol level. So, and one CISO recently told us that they only discover these connections through daily Slack confessions. That's how they're getting visibility today. And why we think that this problem is important to solve and think about now is that from a demand adoption curve standpoint, you see kind of the rapid growth of MCP usage and the number of MCP servers that continue to kind of get built. So that number continues to increase and is scaling exponentially. And we think in 6 months the number of MCP servers that will be out there will be closer to 100,000. So, obviously MCP growth is very high. Um, and Actually, if you go back one more time, Anand, I think just to give folks some more stats, when Claude Desktop was first launched in December of 2024, there were 3,000 MCP servers. By January 2025, so just a month later, major IDs like VS Code and Cursor added support, and then that jumped to like 12,000 very quickly. So, you're seeing kind of this like rapid, not just creation of MCP servers, but usage amongst existing platforms. We go to the next slide. So here's how we're kind of thinking about protecting for this use case. So I wanted to kind of give folks a solution overview of how we're thinking about it and what the first kind of version of some protection is going to look like. The way we're thinking about it is we want to go from detection to governance. So we want to precisely identify like what MCPs are in use. And we want to power that through the forensic search because that's where we feel like is the most obvious place to just do general discovery of MCP that's happening in the environment. And then eventually the app intelligence piece will turn that kind of raw usage into governable kind of adoption of different MCP tools. But together, like with forensic search and app intelligence, hopefully there'll be fewer blind spots, right? Faster investigations if you do learn about MCP usage, and ultimately just safer AI and SaaS adoption across the company. And the Nightfall platform today has mostly been kind of focused on like human initiated data movement and the respective kind of policies and investigations and governance around that. But really, the next challenge for us is what happens when machines start moving data on our behalf continuously and autonomously, and that's really where kind of agentic and MCP based exploitation comes in. So it's both human and AI risk, and that's why you may have seen that on our website. So just in terms of the forensic search capabilities, so it'll look very similar to some of the events that Brian showcased in the last session, but you'll get to see kind of the different MCP calls that are being made, which applications, you'll get some metadata, which users are actually using the underlying applications that are making MCP calls. And crucially, we're going to do this without a man-in-the-middle proxy. So, the friction here is we don't want to introduce any friction, and we don't want your developers to be freaked out by something that's monitoring MCP usage. And some of you may have heard about sort of gateway-based approaches to governing MCPs. I think that, you know, there's kind of pros to that, but the challenges that those also introduce is that it really only kind of protects you for sanctioned MCP usage and not rogue or malicious kind of MCPs. And two, depending on what gateway you're using, if it's adding latency or friction, then obviously your developers might or other employees might get upset about that. So um, that's kind of the MCP preview for forensics, and then in app intelligence, we'll kind of roll that up into an app by app kind of usage metric so that you can just get a general sense of like what's happening in the environment and who's using what.